Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Necessity is the Mother of Manufacturing, a discussion on how manufacturing is central to the success of technology startups and the interactions between legal, finance and design in the journey of new technology development to market. I'm Adam Donath and I'll be hosting today's webinar, where we'll discuss some of the opportunities and insights, challenges and expertise that feature and can produce great outcomes when technology developers and manufacturers work collaboratively together. Central to our discussion today will be the Guida case study, a manufacturer-started technology startup, which will help guide and give context to our discussion. Now, before I introduce the panel, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. A quick note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available within 2 days, and that we'll also be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. I'd also like to thank the organisations that have supported this webinar: Guida Surgical, a new technology startup company; FB Rice, patent and trademark attorneys and R&D tax consulting services; SEMA, Southeast Melbourne's Manufacturing Alliance; and Hydrix, a technology product commercialisation partner. And now to the panel. Bill Hill, give us a wave, Bill.
Hi there.
The Managing Director of Hydrix Surgical. Madeline Kelly, Partner at FB Rice, Melbourne Engineering Group. Kate Mahardy, Director at FB Rice, Tax Consulting Services. And Adam Donath, Business Development with Hydrix. So we've broken today's discussion of new technology commercialisation into 3 high-level areas: front-end idea development and validation, design and engineering, manufacturing engagement and delivery, just to help tease out the different attributes of each phase of the commercialisation journey for our discussion. So jumping straight in at the beginning, Bill, how about you tell us a little more about Guida, the company, the origin of the technology, and why the decision was made to pursue the idea in the first place?
Thanks, Adam. So Guida goes back about well over 10 years now. It came about through a company called Mac Surgical, who manufacture surgical tools for orthopaedic surgeons. So these are largely things that now they look like screwdrivers and hammers, but they're absolutely more sophisticated and quite high quality devices. So Bob worked closely with surgeons, and one day he was talking to one of them. He was customizing a particular instrument for him, and the surgeon was sharing how that in a hip replacement operation, there's a component that gets placed into your pelvis, and the positioning of that component is quite crucial to the outcome of the operation. If it gets slightly malpositioned, it can actually lead to eventual sort of revision surgery. So Bob sort of had a look at the problem, and Bob's previous life before he was a manufacturer of tools was as a navigation instrument maker for Qantas. And so Bob sort of realised that the problem that he's seen was actually a navigation problem, and how to help the surgeon navigate this component into the hip. And so from there, Bob sort of started to look at how he could sort of build a navigation system. And eventually this has turned into the Guida Surgical Navigation System. And so from an idea, from talking to a customer, to today, where we're just getting ready to transfer a new product back into manufacturing, that's a sort of very high level Guida Surgical story.
And Bill, during this early stage, did Bob have a good understanding of the likely time and effort involved in taking this idea to the market? And how did he go about building that understanding? Okay,
I think it would be fair to say no at one level. Product development and medical device development in particular is a challenging process, and it is a very structured process, and there's not many people outside of the sort of development world really know much about it. So Bob probably didn't realise the detail involved. He knew it was challenging because he's in the medical device world, but what he was trying to do was a level above that. And so he had an idea of what was involved, and he knew some people to go and talk to. And so while he didn't know all of the journey, he knew that he didn't know everything, which is probably the first step in sort of building your own capability. And so he started talking to people out with his own initial network.
And Madeline, Bill's raised an interesting point here about recognising that very rarely does a single individual or entity have all the answers. Given the business opportunity ahead of Guida that was built from the close connection of a manufacturer with their end users and the daily problems that they face, what should companies be thinking about in terms of IP and protecting their ideas at such an early stage?
So when taking a business in a new direction by offering a new product or service, or even just starting out fresh, there are two main aspects of intellectual property that need to be considered. So the first is whether you are actually free to operate, whether you can make or sell your product or perform your manufacturing process without actually infringing on others' rights. So if you're moving into a new territory, you may not necessarily be as attuned to what your competitors are doing and what IP rights they might have in place. For example, a third party might have patents covering a particular method of manufacturing that's actually going to be key to your new venture. So these threats can actually be de-risked by performing landscape or freedom to operate searches. These types of searches identify key players in particular markets and what rights they have in place. And if problematic IP rights are identified, it need not necessarily put a stop to your plans. You maybe could instead seek a license from the IP right holder or try to purchase the asset, or you could try to design around or change some aspects of your plans to avoid infringement. So as well as identifying risks, these kinds of searches are actually really great at helping to identify gaps in the market, which can highlight opportunities for areas of development. Now, the second aspect, which is kind of the flip side to freedom to operate, is whether you should be considering protecting some of your own IP and deciding on what aspects of your new venture might be worth protecting. So, for example, you might want to look at trademark protection to secure protection for a new brand. A trademark effectively acts like a receptacle for your reputation and helps to distinguish you from your competitors in the market. If there's something unique or important about the way your product looks, you should probably consider design protection. Design protection is limited in that it is only covers the overall appearance of your product, but it is relatively low cost. And of course, if your venture involves technology that's solving some sort of technical problem in a new way, you may be able to secure patent rights for that solution. For example, your invention might be a product, maybe an end product or even an intermediate product, manufacturing material, manufacturing process, or even software configured to perform a particular manufacturing process. And of course, another thing you should consider are trade secrets. So for example, there might be some specific tricks to making a manufacturing process run more smoothly. And although maybe it's not going to be patentable, it might still give you a competitive advantage in the market. And it's worth capturing and treating those kind of tricks as trade secrets. So there's clearly a lot to consider here around IP. And the time to create an IP strategy, which is effectively a framework mapping your IP considerations to your business plans, is at the outset of the new venture. And I'm interested, Bill, how did Guider approach IP in the beginning?
Well, I'd love to say that we had a perfect strategy from the beginning, but I would be telling lies, to be honest. I think like most startups, initially your first instance is to look at protecting what you think is a new invention. And the strategy part really didn't come until much later, several years later. And I think in hindsight now, when we did some more strategic work and had an FTO and things like that, we identified a number of areas of the patent where we may have taken a different route and built out some more protection, but we also identified some interesting opportunities for people we could have licensed some IP off of too. And so while I'd love to say we were perfect, we were far from it, but we'll live and learn for the next time.
And Kate, we've just spoken about some of the early stage activities here that typically incur some costs in terms of IP protection, etc. Can companies offset these costs of their R&D activities, and what grants or incentives are available to them while they're undertaking this early stage R and R&D?
Sure. There are a range of grants that are available on either a state or a federal level, but the government's key flagship program is the R&D tax incentive, which has been around since the 1980s in various forms, and this latest form since 2011. So it's had bipartisan support and has been, and it is a well-supported program. It's a self-assessed program, which makes it quite a good one as well, and it enables companies that are undertaking R&D to offset the costs of their R&D, where they are provided a 43.5% offset for small to medium entities. And this can be refundable if you're in losses, so that cash flow is really, really important to a lot of companies undertaking R&D. It's an industry-based program rather than a academic type of research program. So it's generally centered around developing new or improved products or processes, services and the like. And so Guider's product, our new product, is definitely square in that area, but improvements are also eligible under the program. And there's a lot of R&D in manufacturing, in developing new or improved products, and on the process side as well. So we have a lot of claims in the manufacturing space, and it's one of the largest areas of R&D tax in terms of an industry take-up of the program. There are other grants and vouchers available at various points, but they can change in terms of their timelines and their eligibility requirements. So it's best to stay in contact with people like your SEMA representative, or your government representative in the state or federal level, or your R&D tax consultant, who will be across some of these programs, because they might have short application windows, so you can work through that.
Okay. And what should the cost considerations be for developing a new product?
So there aren't many programs that are going to provide you the costs up front for your R&D. So the company still needs to be able to bear the costs associated with the R&D development. But in order to take advantage of the R&D tax incentive program to the best ability, it's also about developing documentation and tracking, and making sure you're tracking both the technical and the financial aspects of your program in order to maximise your claim and also to be compliant under the program.
So we spoke about product development side here, and I think you touched on the processes as well. What about problem solving for existing products or processes and improvements? Do they also attract these credits or incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the companies that we deal with are doing exactly that around that, the problem solving, developing improvements, which is a key part of the R&D as well. So definitely improvements to products or processes, and problem solving for issues that you're seeing in those is definitely an area of R&D.
Okay. And Bill, how did Guider go about approaching funding for the R&D and IP protection stage?
I suppose we touched on most of the things that Kate talked about there. I mean, in the early stages, it really is a bit of friends and family, where all you've got is a basic idea, and so you really have to invest your own money and own time to sort of prove the principle of that. So that was very much the early stages, and that allowed you to tap into a little bit of the R&D tax. As we sort of developed, once we had the proof of principle, we raised a little bit of private capital. And then further developed the product into a bit of a concept, and did some very early clinical work to sort of prove that concept as well. Now at this stage, because of the efficacy of the product, we actually raised a good bit more capital, and then sort of started to sort of tap into some of the grant programs, and we were fortunate enough to be awarded a strategic growth program grant from the Victorian government, which is actually pivotal for us in securing that next stage of funding from our private funders as well. And so that really funded our sort of R&D sort of from there. We also tapped into the R&D tax refund scheme, because that enabled us to sort of now really leverage the rest of our funds. And one thing I'd actually say about that is that Kate sort of rightly said it's a self-assessment. It is a complex process though. There are things that I certainly wouldn't have considered necessarily applying or registering as part of the R&D, but when you understand the process, there are a number of activities that you can claim that aren't necessarily obvious, and there's things that you may think are obvious for claiming that you can't claim on. So my recommendation there is now really engage someone that knows what they're talking about in the R&D tax side of things, And I think it was one of the best investments we made, because the consultants sort of pay for themselves, and also protect you a little bit as well, because it is a self-assessment process. You may not be audited this year, but you could be audited several years in advance, and sort of then come back to a position where you may have to pay some of that back if you haven't assessed yourself properly. So engage an expert. And then ultimately, sort of, we're in the position now where we're raising additional cash, which we've just done, and that comes off of the sort of ongoing R&D. And so this year we'll make more use of the R&D tax credit again, and eventually we'll hopefully sort of raise additional funds next year to support the commercialisation.
Great. So moving into the second phase, excuse me, it's moving into the second high-level phase of development, where we can talk about product design and engineering. Bill, you mentioned or hinted at the idea of a high-level program plan and the approach to seeking funding, etc. Now, at this point, there's many options on the table in terms of creating a development and commercialization roadmap for a new technology. Perhaps you can share with us a little more on, I guess, some of the key topics or larger topics here about how Guider approached the roadmap creation phase.
Yeah, so once we'd done the early proof of concept work, the issue then became sort of, now, is there a market for it? How much will it take to develop it? And how long is it going to take to develop it? And so we were, again, this was some of the first initial funding of the Victorian Government Strategic Growth Programme, was that you can, with match funding, really take a look at the business case in detail. And so we had a look at the business case to assess whether or not there is a market there. Having established that there was a sizable market, we then sort of looked at what it would take to develop it. And so we worked out a high-level program, and this was with Hydrix, as Hydrix is our engineering partner. So we worked out that high-level development program, and then looked at costing it. And that gave us a budget to go back to our finance sort of partners with, and also allowed us to apply for the second stage of that strategic growth program. And so between the grant and the capital, that then allowed us to sort of now go further forward and really develop up the project.
And I guess at the early stage, Bill, you had a choice in front of you as to whether to develop an in-house team or outsource or a combination of the both. How did you go about that decision process?
Well, my background is in product development, and I've worked for a number of consultants over the years. And product development is a trade-off between sort of, not a trade-off, but your goal is to get your product to market in as quick a time as possible. And it is then a sort of time versus cost trade-off. As I say, my background's in this area. I'm a believer that a product development team with the processes and capabilities in place is far quicker than trying to establish that on your own. And so for me, there was a definite sort of path and a strategy of outsourcing the engineering development to a team that is ready to go, rather than having to take sort of 6 months to a year to build that team. And waste that time in essence and be a year later getting to market. And so that was a key consideration for me when we were actually sort of deciding which way we were going and choosing our sort of our development plan and development strategy.
And I'm not sure if this is my connection or yours, Bill, but you've got a little quiet in the background there. Might be mine. That's all right, Bill. Look, I think it might be worth touching on then about the can indeed. Perhaps then we can touch on how you identified the options of or the possible options for a development partner, and how you ultimately selected your development partner too.
Yeah, I suppose there's kind of two options for your development partner. There's the team that will do exactly as you tell them, and they are the team that will collaborate with you and work with you and consult with you. And so I was looking for a team that were consulting, because at the early stages of device development, you can't tell the team what to do because you're in problem solving mode. And so I wanted a team with experience, and I wanted a team that had that sort of collaborative approach to life. And so that's why I went down the route with a consulting partner as opposed to just a contracting partner.
Understood. And Madeline, now that we're in the design and engineering phase here, you've spoken about an IP strategy and a framework. How does the approach to IP evolve, and what should companies consider and or be careful of at this stage in design and engineering?
Yeah, so best practice, like I said, is to really devise that IP strategy at the outset, and it should align with the business plans. But as those business plans evolve and change, you should expect that that's going to have some impact on your IP strategy. So you should view your IP strategy as something that needs to be revisited and potentially revised on a regular basis. And the product design and engineering stage is certainly a time at which the IP strategy needs to be consulted. So, for example, as modifications to the original idea, product, or process are made during this stage, any patent applications that have been filed will need to be carefully considered to make sure that they still actually cover any changes that are being made to the product or process. And if the scope of the patent application doesn't, that appropriate steps are taken to either update that patent application if possible, or to consider filing new patent applications to make sure that you're getting the scope of protection that you need. Depending on the circumstances, it might actually be prudent to wait until this stage before you file any design applications, because any changes to the way the product looks is likely going to mean that any earlier design applications that you might have filed will probably not cover the product that you're looking to supply at the end of the day. So that's just something to bear in mind. And you also want to make sure that any trade secrets are being identified and treated appropriately.
And Kate, Bill mentioned that Guida worked with the aid of an engineering and commercialisation partner. When working with a partner, whether that be a commercial entity, university, or research organisation, what are the considerations that companies should take into account with such a collaboration?
Yeah, so the collaboration is an interesting one with R&D because it's obviously something that's really helpful for companies that need to bring in that expertise, particularly when they're changing a product or developing something new like Guida was involved in. Research service providers are companies like Hydrix, and also includes things like universities and other research organisations, and they do work on behalf of the claimant entity. So the R&D from a research service provider is for the R&D entity that's the company that's claiming. If you're engaging with other parties that aren't research service providers, and there's a list of those on the government websites, if you're engaging with other parties, you need to look at, I guess, whose R&D it is. It's called the on own behalf test. And that covers things like who has financial risk, who has control, and who has the ability to commercialise the results. And it tends to be a bit of a grey area, and we would look at the contracts between parties to see whose R&D it is in those circumstances. So it's important to make sure you get your R&D advisor to have a look at what that contract looks like and before you sign, potentially if you want to claim it under R&D.
And are there other ways companies can access funding for their own product development?
Yeah, so Bill touched on a number of the areas, and it's such a great case study of all the different areas that you can access funding for, you know, either through the government or through other means. There's a range of different grants available, things like ARC linkage grants or technology vouchers when they're available for collaborations with university. There's grants around that. So you need to, I guess, again, be aware of what's available at the time for some of those fundings. Outside of R&D and moving into that product development stage where you've got a product that you need to commercialise or either scale up, there might be the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant, which Bill also touched on before. So that's a great grant, but you need to be aware that it's, unlike the self-assessed R&D tax program, it's a competitive program. It's merit-based. It takes a while to get these grants if you do get them. They're generally matched funding, so you need to still be able to put up generally 50% of the R&D expenditure, and sometimes for things like the future industry funds, it's 1 to 3, where the company puts up 3 to the 1 contribution from the government. So, but the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant is a fantastic program, and it operates like a venture capital. So there's a lot of requirements to get through without the sharing of the IP with the government, without the sharing of IP as you would find in a venture capital situation. So, and then there's normal channels like Bill talked about in terms of angel investment or funding through VC and investor presentations and the like that companies can engage with.
Okay, well, lastly, let's take a look at the manufacturing engagement side, where and how it influences the product development journey. So, Bill, perhaps you can tell us a little about the approach that Guida has taken to manufacturing. And I may have missed this earlier when my line went fuzzy, but perhaps also including when just a little discussion on when you started to engage in a manufacturer in the design process as well.
Yeah, so our sort of overall strategy from a business point of view has been to outsource to organisations that can provide capability that would take us a long time to build ourselves, with the goal of getting to market quickly. So we outsource the engineering development to engineering partners, and we have outsourced the manufacturing to manufacturing partners. That gives us a number of benefits. First of all, you can tap into their manufacturing capability. I don't have to build that capability, but I actually don't have to invest in the capital side of it or the process side of it. These are people that have got all of that already in place, so you can get your product to market fairly quickly. So that was a central part to our sort of strategy there. And in terms of when we engaged them, we engaged most partners fairly early, really during the design phase. And that sort of gives you benefits in a number of ways. It allows you to bring to bear their knowledge of how your product will be manufactured. And you need to sort of put that into the design phase, because the way you manufacture something can add an awful lot of cost to your product. And designers are good designers, but they may not know the specifics of the manufacturing process that's going to be engaged. So gauging your manufacturer early is definitely something that you should do. And we try to engage our manufacturing partners early in the process to maximise that benefit.
Understood. And Bill, I think that some of the manufacturing partners you've chosen have been in Australia as well. Did you know at the beginning of the journey that were you consciously looking for an Australian manufacturing partner? Was that the conscious direction at the beginning?
Not really. When we started, it was conscious in two particular cases. All of the metallic components are manufactured by Max Surgical, where we spin out from. And the electronics were being done by SRS Global, because we were partnering with them as well. But all of the higher volume consumable work and then the sterilisation and the packaging, I thought we'd possibly have to go offshore for that. But I've been pleasantly surprised at the capabilities that we found. Our injection molded consumable supplier is based in Braeside, a company called Hostical. And our sterilisation and packaging partner are based in Sydney, Sabre Medical. And these are both world-class manufacturers and providers. And so we've actually ended up with a fully Australian manufactured product. And one of the things, I suppose, is that in many ways, medical device manufacturing for sort of reasonably complex products, but low volumes if you compare them to consumer products, is actually where manufacturing sweet spot is in Australia. It's not the mass manufacturing of major global products. So there was a lot of capability we came across, and it's very gratifying that all of our product is made here.
Good news story indeed. Kate, with respect to manufacturing transfer and routine manufacturing, are there other support programs available for companies at that point?
Not a huge amount at the moment. So the government is about to have a budget, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. There's normally some funding for the manufacturing sector of some description, and it depends on what that looks like, really, I suppose. So there's a state, we've also got a state budget coming up as well in Victoria. So we'll see what sort of things come out of that. But at the moment, you know, there's the R&D tax, the Accelerating Commercialisation grant, and then there's things like the Future Industry Funds, which Bill referred to before, and that includes the 6 high growth sectors that we've talked about, so medtech and pharma, new energy, food, fibre, and again, talk to SEMA or your regional representative or your R&D consultant to understand a little bit more about the requirements of that program. Again, just a reminder as well that that program in particular is a 1 to 3 basis in terms of funding. So there's the company will still need to, I guess, fork out the 3 out of that 1. So, it's one to look at. The other program, when you're looking to expand into other markets, is things like the Export Market Development Program, which is a fantastic program for when you're and been around for quite a long time, for when you're looking to expand into those overseas market and travel again, maybe.
And how does that work, the EMDG program?
Yeah, so I think they'll have lots of money in it this last year, because one of the key areas is around the travel, and helps offset some of the costs of travel for when you're looking at those international markets, which I guess will be a small part of people's claims this last year. But the Export Market Development Grant provides a 50% offset to the costs after the first 5,000, with a minimum amount of 15,000 claimed. You can also claim for the first 2 years together in your first claim, so it can be quite a good program. It covers things like travel, trade show, international IP, which is obviously a big cost. And part of that IP strategy that Madeline was talking about, and so looking at your international IP, marketing consultants, samples, it's a range of different things that it covers. So again, documentation is key. So making sure you're tracking those costs associated with those things, but it's a really good program.
And Madeline, circling back to the evolution of the IP strategy, as we start looking at routine manufacture and perhaps the global markets as well, what should companies be thinking about in terms of the strategy and protection here?
So look, I think as everybody appreciates, costs are an important factor, and IP costs can be significant. Most IP rights are secured on a country-by-country basis. So for example, if you have a patent for a product in Australia, but you've no patent in the US, you won't be able to prevent somebody from making or using your invention in the US. So it can actually get very expensive to pursue protection with broad geographical coverage, and strategic decisions need to be made as to which are going to be the most important jurisdictions. Once you file a patent application or a design application, the clock starts ticking, and you have a limited amount of time before you need to be making those calls on those overseas jurisdictions. So for example, with designs, it's 6 months from your first filing. With patents, it's 12 months, but that 12-month period can be further extended to a further 18 months by filing what's called a PCT, or an international patent application. But again, at the end of that time period, if you don't take up the option of securing patent protection in those overseas jurisdictions, you actually lose the opportunity to do it. Intellectual property can be among a company's most valuable assets. It can build and preserve brand value and reputation, and it can contribute significantly to a company's valuation. But you do need to make your IP work for you. So you need to consider whether your intellectual property is giving you an advantage over your competitors, maybe by restricting or excluding them from particular markets. And if it's not, you need to consider how it might be used. Could you instead use it to generate revenue, for example, through some sort of licensing scheme, or even by selling your IP assets? And if an IP portfolio costs money to maintain and keep those rights in place, and it needs to be regularly revisited to make sure that those assets are actually working for you. And if they're not, you should consider culling your portfolio and maybe redirecting those valuable funds into new R&D opportunities, for example.
So Bill, let's perhaps close the loop here and circle back to the GUIDA study now that we've spoken about the 3 phases here. What are perhaps some of the key takeaways that you might mention from this discussion, and also from your own experiences within the broader GUIDA story?
Yeah, I think the first thing in the broader GUIDA story is this goal of a manufacturer's customer being the source of a new business and a new manufacturing opportunity. I mean, I've been lucky enough over my career to work with some of the larger companies like Coca-Cola and Philips, and they have extensive customer outreach programs where they're looking to identify opportunities for the future. But it's just as valid for a smaller manufacturer to go looking for an opportunity and develop it as well. And it really comes about from sort of understanding what problems your customers have, and then taking a sort of a view of how you may go about solving that. So that was something that sort of come across and was sort of emphasised to me that now it's not just something that the big companies can do. The smaller companies can do this as well. I think the second 2 points I've sort of kind of touched on briefly during the process. I think the first one is in terms of your R&D tax refunds, it's a complex process, and it is very easy to sort of get it wrong. And I think it's now very worthwhile engaging with an expert in the area to sort of guide you through that sort of complex labyrinth of sort of rules and regulations. It really isn't that straightforward. And the third one is now with the IP side of things. We engaged later in the process with our IP lawyers. And I think if we'd engaged earlier, we'd have identified a number of sort of potential commercial opportunities that we might not really have sort of, well, we didn't see until a bit later. It precluded one or two things actually happening in the process. And so I think if we'd engaged earlier with our IP lawyers, it'd been better for us. We can bring the commercial side and the commercial side, though. The lawyers can bring the legal commercial side to it. And between you can then sort of craft a strategy that will be the best for your business. And having not done that early enough, I would feel that we could have made sort of more of a business in the way through.
Indeed. Well, Bill, Kate, Madeline, thank you very much for the insights here. I think we've come to the close of the discussion, but let's open up to questions from the audience here, and let me reshuffle my desktop as I open up the chat window to find out the questions. But I think that the first one we've got here is the best approach. I guess the question is, what's the best approach to protecting trade secrets when you've engaged an engineering consultancy as opposed to an internal technical team?
So I assume that's for me, Adam, is it? So really, to be a trade secret, the information or know-how needs to not be commonly known. It needs to give you some sort of advantage over your competitors, and you must have taken steps to keep it secret. So clearly manufacturing methods and know-how that are already out in the public domain and are known by the general public aren't secret, and keeping it secret is key. So really you should be looking at how best to do that. So making sure that, you know, there are adequate clauses about how trade secrets should be treated in employment contracts, that access to the trade secret is restricted. So for example, if the trade secrets involve some aspect of your manufacturing process, you want to make sure that access to the manufacturing process is restricted, so people can't inspect it and decipher any of that valuable know-how from inspection. You want to make sure that your employees are actually trained on the protection of trade secrets and confidential information. And finally, you really need to have documentation which captures what the trade secrets are. And that documentation that contains the trade secrets needs to be marked and stored and handled with sufficient care to maintain the confidentiality.
So there is another question here for you, Madeline. Question in two parts. So what methods can be used to value intangible assets such as IP? And part two, how important has IP been when speaking with investors and potential acquirers?
So I would suggest that maybe Bill could handle the second question. But the first question is how to evaluate IP. And there are many experts who actually have built businesses in doing just that. It's not something that we do at FB Rice, but I can certainly put you in touch with people if that is something that you would like recommendations on. But it's a fine art really, and I can't help with giving you tips and tricks for that, but I can put you in touch with the right people to help you with it.
I can maybe take a stab at both. So, in a prior existence, one of the things that we did was actually value technologies and IP. And the kind of methodology you take is to sort of, you work out what your development cost is at a high level, and then you look at what your market opportunity is, again, at a sort of fairly high level, and you can get into this as much detail as you like. And then you look at the costs involved in getting you to market. And effectively you work out those three buckets, and then you do a net present value. And so you end up with what looks like an accurate number. And then you go through the black art of sort of looking at your projected interest rates and your sort of discount rates that will be applied to it for market risk, and you end up with a number. And the number can be anywhere, to be honest. The good valuers can make it any number they like, and if you're on the side of a buyer, you'll make it as small as possible, and if you're on the side of a seller, you'll make it as large as possible, and you'll negotiate to get there. But as Madeline says, it's something of a black art. There's a science behind it, but it is a negotiation at the end of the day. There is no hard and fast number. The only time you know you've got it right is when someone signs a check for it. And the second part of the question there, Adam, was...
that was about how important has IP been when speaking with investors? Yeah,
it is very important. The investors want to see that there's a protection for the asset that they're going to invest in. They want to know that if you're going to go and create a guide or product, that at the end of the day, someone just can't come along and copy you in a marketplace. As Madeline says, if you've got no protection in America or no protection in China, someone can manufacture your product based off of your patent application somewhere else, and go ahead and compete with you fairly openly and with no legal constraints on them. So you need to be clear that your IP protection is in the markets that you intend to exploit, and your investors will give you some fairly searching questions about your level of protection and exactly what your patent protects, because there's one thing about what your patent says it protects, but when it comes down to it, when you've done your freedom to operate, there's then what your patent actually protects, and this is the value creating component that you claim it is. And so your IP is very important to the investors, and if you don't have any, it doesn't mean to say you won't get investment, but it will change the nature of your investment.
So, Bill, there's a few more questions coming in for you as well, and we'll put you on the spot here. But I think you might have touched on this one earlier on about what stage Guider is at now, and what happens next for Guider.
Yeah, so we are currently just producing or validating our manufacturing processes. So the injection molding tools, we got the injection molder, the electronics people are manufacturing the boards. And in October, we'll do the assembly of our first production units. And from there, we go through a fairly sort of detailed process of what's called verification and validation testing. And that then gets wrapped up into an application to the regulatory authorities to get approval to sell. And we hope to apply for that sometime Q1 next year. And from there, that would then put us in a position to raise further funds to support our go-to-market. And so that's where we are at the moment. So we're very busy and a very exciting stage after a long development process.
And perhaps a question here that maybe a little bit philosophical as well, but a good one to perhaps close the discussion on. Bill, have you got any tips for manufacturers for identifying problems to potentially build a base of a new business from?
It's a good question. The things I've seen that have worked in the past is understanding what your customer's trying to do with your particular product, and looking at the problems they have, and then looking at the things that they might do either side of what they're doing with your product. So what other jobs might they be doing before they're using your product, and what jobs might they be doing after they're using your products, and what can you do to help them solve those jobs or those problems in the process. And that seems to be the sort of way that you can create a new opportunity. And so I think it's really having your eyes open, and your questioning hat on, so to sort of identify and be aware that some problems might exist, and then being brave enough and sort of intrepid enough to try a solution and work with your customer to sort of try and sort of reach a solution to their problems. That's as much as I can say. I don't think there's any black magic or art to it. I think it's identifying a problem and solving it, which is the nature of most products at the end of the day.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you to all the panelists, Bill, Kate, Madeline. Thank you to the questions from the audience as well. And just a last minute reminder again that the video will be posted in a couple of days to you all. So from this side of the screen, thank you to you all. Stay safe and keep innovating until we next meet up. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
everyone.
See you. Bye.